Hi, welcome to this video. My name is Anthony Billington and I'm the pastor of the Beacon Church in Ashton in Makerfield in the UK. We recently started a series in our Sunday evening meetings on the book of Esther. We were unable to record the meeting a few weeks back, so I hoped it would be helpful to capture the material here so that people can listen back if they want to do so. We began looking at the book of Esther a few weeks back under this overall title of God Behind the Scene. We said that Esther tends to be a neglected book in our churches, and so we hope that it would be interesting and helpful for us to look at it together to see what God might have to say to us through this part of his word. Now, just as a quick recap, we said that when it comes to reading the book of Esther, it's helpful to think of it in three dimensions: history, literature, and theology. Esther is history, and the accounts recorded in this book are based on historical occurrences. But that history is written up as a story, which works brilliantly as a piece of literature which draws us into what's going on. And it's through that combination of history and literature that we get the book's theology, or its message, if you prefer, what it tells us about God and the way God works in the world. Well, then we looked at the first 9 verses of the book with its description of those three different banquets, where we saw something of a dangerous empire. It's an empire, we said, which is inescapable, which seems invincible, and which looks impressive until, that is, you take a closer look. Because then last time we looked at the rest of chapter 1, where we thought about Vashti, the defiant queen. We looked at the Queen's refusal to parade her beauty in front of the King's drunken male associates as if she was just another one of his dancing girls. And we looked at the King's seemingly out of proportion response, not only in banishing Vashti forever from his presence, but by sending a message around the empire that every man should be ruler in his own home, just like the king was in his. Except, of course, he wasn't. And we saw that the passage tells us something about the world in which we live as God's people today, as exiles ourselves or strangers in the world. And we saw something as well of the God to whom we look. Xerxes may have all the trappings of power, but in truth, we get to the end of chapter 1 and his power has been exposed as a bit of a sham. But as the story unfolds, the eye of faith will be able to see God working for his people's good. And so we come to our next passage, which tells us something of a demeaning contest. Now, it's been said that in some ways, Esther's rise to power in the Persian Empire resembles the story of Cinderella, if you know that story. In the fairy tale, the prince is in search of his true love and so gathers together all the eligible bachelorettes in the kingdom to a ball. When Cinderella captures his heart, she goes from rags to riches. The big difference is that Cinderella captures the king's heart by dancing, whereas Esther has to do more than just dance. What we'll do is we'll go through the story itself first. We'll look at it in 3 stages. But then I want us to step back and ask how we should think about what's going on here. So we begin with a new proposal in verses 1 to 4. Let's dive in with verse 1. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. As the curtain rises on chapter 2, King Xerxes has sobered up and calmed down. The word remembered there is more than just recalling what had gone on. It's a sense of recalling something with affection or nostalgia. She's gone and he misses her. Now, what we know from history is that between the events of chapter 1 and this chapter, he'd been off to war with Greece and had been humiliated. It's a famous war, perhaps most well known for the Battle of Thermopylae. The war went on for about 2 years, but eventually the Greeks turned back the Persians with their superior armor and superior tactics. Anyway, King Xerxes came home defeated, driven back by smaller but smarter armies. And it's this Xerxes we find in chapter 2. Now, if this story was being filmed, we'd be seeing the king in some lavish personal quarters in the palace, attended by good-looking, strapping young men. And these young men who attend the king make a proposal in verses 2 to 4. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now, the attendants here are probably a different group from the civil servants we met back in chapter 1. But once again, this all-powerful king, ruler of 127 provinces from India to North Africa, relies on others to tell him what to do. And what are they proposing? Well, a Miss Persian Empire competition. Except, of course, it's more sordid even than that. There are 3 qualifications for entrance. They have to be A, beautiful, B, young, and C, virgins. There's no way to soften it or sweeten it or sugarcoat it, but the actual competition here is a sex contest, with the winner being whoever most pleases the king during her night with him. We don't know what the women themselves would have thought of this. History doesn't really give us access to their voices, and it might be unhelpful to speculate. But in today's terms, we have to think of young women being trafficked from their homes and families, subjected to sex at the whim of an abusive man, and then shut away afterwards in some luxury, to be fair, but never to be known by another man and never to raise a family. The historian Josephus numbered Xerxes' harem at around 400 women. It's sexist, yes, but it's mostly exploitative. And it's been said Xerxes was an equal opportunities exploiter, because at the same time, the empire needed a steady supply of boys to be castrated so they also could serve in the harem. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that 500 boys were taken from Babylonia and Assyria every year and castrated so they could serve in the Persian court. As one commentator has pointed out, everyone's sexuality was at the king's disposal. So that brings us to the second part of the story, new characters in verses 5 to 7. Because in a sense, the story is interrupted at this point to introduce us to the 2 main characters of the book. And in our mind's eye, our camera now moves from the king's palace to an area in the citadel of Susa to take in a man and a young woman. In the book so far, no connection has been made with the rest of the biblical story, but now a connection is made. Look at verses 5 and 6. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So here we meet a Jew. He's in the citadel, which suggests he's some kind of civil servant. His name is Mordecai, which is a Babylonian name and sounds like the name of the Babylonian god Marduk. He comes from the tribe of Benjamin and has a genealogy which includes someone called Kish, which was the name of the father of King Saul, also of the tribe of Benjamin. And that connection with Saul will become important later in the book, so we need to log it away somewhere. And the other thing to spot is that he's in exile. Now, when it says that Mordecai had been carried into exile, it almost certainly means that his family were among the exiles rather than Mordecai himself. Otherwise, Mordecai would be a very old man by this point. So his ancestors came from Jerusalem. Maybe he was born himself in exile, but he's in exile now, not in Jerusalem. In fact, though, more than that, his ancestors were among those deported to Babylon with King Jehoiakim. So it's likely that Mordecai's family were among the ruling classes, the cream of the crop, who were taken into exile first. So that's Mordecai. Then we're introduced to the Next main character in verse 7. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So Esther is an orphan and she has two names. Hadassah is her Hebrew name, meaning something like myrtle, and Esther is her Persian name. And just like Mordecai, Esther's name sounds like the name of a Babylonian god, this time the goddess Ishtar. The two names might hint at the tension that she'll experience. Will she be loyal to her people, or will she be assimilated into the world empire? But what's more, she has a pretty face and an attractive figure. And that sets us up for the next part of the story, which is a new queen. What happens in verse 8 is that the king's edict is made, and many young women, including Esther, are brought into the king's harem. Verse 8. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. Now, were they willing or reluctant? Well, we're not told. Was Esther willing or reluctant? We're not told. As we'll see, some commentators make her out to be pious and reluctant at what's going on. Others say, no, she was compromised and willing. We're simply told that she was taken, but we don't know for sure whether she had a choice in the matter. And nor does that word taken help us. That may sound like she was taken into the palace against her will, but it's exactly the same word that's used of Mordecai taking her as his daughter back in verse 7. So it's not necessarily a negative word. Anyway, she seems to do quite well there, as verse 9 tells us. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. So the harem was a competitive place by the sounds of it. The girls would have been assessed and ranked. Again, this is how the empire of the world works. And anyway, Esther did quite well. And the sense is that she was proactive in this. She was promoted to a place where the most promising girls lived and were given special privileges, even more beauty treatments, good quality food, and a set of personal assistants, 7 of them. But we perhaps get a hint of danger in verse 10. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Now, perhaps we're meant to understand it was dangerous to be open about belonging to God's people, but we know that Daniel and his 3 friends were willing to stick out. So, is she being discreet and wise in keeping her head down? Or are she and Mordecai being cowards for not standing up? Again, the verse tells us nothing about their motives or thoughts. And verse 11. Every day he, that's Mordecai, walked to and fro near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So Mordecai seems to have found ways of getting messages to and from Esther, which becomes significant later in the book. And now the process of the competition is described in all its gory detail in verses 12 to 14. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So we can see that this preparation was long, 12 months preparation for one night with the king. Now, I know it's standard fare to joke about how long some women take to get ready to go out for a night, but 12 months is pushing the limit, surely. Well, anyway, after these extravagant preparations, each woman was allowed to take whatever she wanted into the king's bedroom. It's not said what she might bring in, although we can imagine it might be some food or wine that the king liked, or some aphrodisiacs of some sort, or maybe an item of clothing or some jewelry. In any case, she had one night to be with the king, and then in the morning she would return, but to a different part of the harem. It looks as if the harem was divided into two sections, one for the virgins, the women who had not yet slept with the king, and one for the concubines, the women who had slept with the king. So, in the department for virgins, the woman was beautified for her night with the king. She would get in line and wait her turn and go when called. And then, after her night with the king, she would then be transferred to the department for concubines, where she would wait out the rest of her days. She wouldn't see the king again unless he called for her by name. She wouldn't be able to leave the harem and have a husband of her own or children of her own. But after all this build-up, then comes Esther in verses 15 and 16. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So Esther takes Hegai's advice on what to take with her into the king. As someone who waited on the king, Hegai would at least have had some insight into what would please the king. So although some have seen her as indifferent or passive, her actions here can also be seen as quite shrewd. So she gets her turn, and it's a significant enough moment that the writer gives us the date. The night falls in the 7th year of the king's reign, so about 4 years after the start of the story. But how will Esther do? As it turns out, very well, as verses 17 and 18 tell us. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Now, the word love is used there, but it doesn't necessarily imply any emotional bond. Nevertheless, Esther is crowned queen, and the celebrations follow with yet another feast. A public holiday is proclaimed, and gifts are given out, or there's a remission of some taxes of some sort. The king has got what he wanted, a beautiful queen wearing a crown at a feast. So, what are we to make of all this? What were you thinking, I wonder, as we've been making our way through the story? In particular, what were you feeling towards Mordecai and Esther? Sympathy with them, perhaps, for the situation in which they found themselves, or frustration with them, maybe, for the way they seemed to go about things. And as it happens, Jewish and Christian readers down the years have taken different views about what's going on here. So, for some, the big lesson in this part of the chapter is the danger of being exploited by the world. The taking of women to serve in the harem shows that living in the world means living under exploitative power. We live in a world where the most powerful people treat other people as existing merely for their benefit rather than having dignity in their own right. And Mordecai and Esther find themselves caught up in that in a way that's not at all of their own doing. They were exiles in the Persian Empire, but we know that many chose to stay behind when others went back home. There's no explicit criticism of that here. And as we've seen so far, the whole of chapters 1 and 2 tell us something about the dangerous world in which we must live as God's people. Now, I'm sure every so often we get to see its power exposed for what it really is. But the people of God are living under exploitative power, living as exiles, having to negotiate their dual identity as belonging to God and yet being part of the world and vulnerable in the world. So that's one view of what's going on here, the danger of being exploited by the world. But many have taken a different view and say, no, what we see here actually is the danger of being assimilated into the world. So this is a view of those who feel uncomfortable with Esther's rise from a nobody to a queen. And here we can come back to this issue of exile. What are they doing so far away from the land of Israel? They weren't compelled to be in Susa, so why hadn't they returned? Plus, there's no concern in this book, as there is in other books from this period, like Daniel or Nehemiah, no concern for the land or for Jerusalem or for the temple. So, does the apparent lack of desire for their homeland hint that they've been assimilated, chameleon like, into Persian culture? Well, yes, of course, it's one thing to abide by the customs of a society in which you live, but had Mordecai and Esther gone too far? And then there are their names. As we said, Mordecai comes from the name of the Babylonian god Marduk, and his name means something like man of Marduk or worshipper of Marduk. Esther, as we've said, appears to be named after the goddess of love and war, Ishtar. In fact, in Babylonian mythology, Marduk and Ishtar were cousins, just as Mordecai and Esther were. We know that Daniel and his friends were given pagan names when they went to Babylon, but they're not always referred to by their pagan names in the book, and those names were given to them by the authorities, but we get no hint of that here in the book of Esther. And then there's the point that Mordecai had forbidden Esther to reveal her Jewish identity, and we might wonder why, and how much would she have had to compromise to get ahead in this worldly Persian kingdom? How many of the laws would she have to break? What about the food laws? Did she honor the Sabbath? And in particular, what about foreign marriage? Now, of course, the issue wasn't mixed marriage per se, as we learn from the book of Ruth, where the Israelite Boaz marries Ruth, a Moabite, but who's been made part of the covenant with Israel. So the issue was marrying people outside the Jewish faith. And we know from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that God's people marrying foreign outsiders to the faith was a big no-no at this time. So Esther's marriage to Xerxes ends up copying one of the key failures of God's people at this point in their history. Now, interestingly, this sense of discomfort with the book was felt even not long after the book was written. When it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, the translators added bits to the book to soften it. So in the Greek translation, Esther says that she's not violated the food laws and that she abhorred the bed of the uncircumcised king. But we're not told that in the biblical book, which only begs the question, did she compromise too much to keep her family background and ethnicity hidden? And why did she go along with the contest? And why did Mordecai let her? And how did she manage to do so well that she ended up marrying a pagan foreign king? Or we might say, well, she didn't have a choice in the matter. What else could she do? But she arguably did have a choice in the matter. We've already seen that with Vashti. We see in the book of Daniel that as much as God's people were part of the wider fabric of society, they could and did resist when push came to shove on things that mattered to them. So it's possible to read this part of Esther chapter 2 and to see unmarried Esther's presence in the pagan king's bed as morally ambiguous at best. And at worst, it shows the great degree to which God's people had become assimilated into the wider culture at this time. So what are we to think? Are Esther and Mordecai heroes or villains? Now, to a large degree, we don't know for certain. We're simply not told. There's no line which says, and so Esther did evil in the eyes of the Lord, or, lo, the Lord was with Esther and he prospered her. One of the geniuses of the book is that the writer doesn't tell us. The story is told in such a way that the motivations and desires and intentions and thoughts of the characters are kept from us. And that's a great strategy for drawing us in. The book is written in a way that obliges us to get involved and to ask those questions. But because the writer doesn't tell us, it may well be that they're saying that's not the point of the book. We're to resist the temptation to moralize, to use Mordecai and Esther as role models. So I have a long-winded third implication, which puts the first two options together in a way that I hope we find helpful. And it goes like this: that whether exploitation or assimilation, the book tells us of the comfort of God being at work, albeit sometimes unseen, in the world. In other words, both apply in different ways at different times. Yes, living in the world brings with it the danger of being exploited. And yes, living in the world brings with it the danger of being assimilated. But either way, the book of Esther will tell us by the time we get to the end of it, either way, we can be assured that God is still at work in the world, even at those times when he seems most absent. When it comes to the book of Esther, we only see the actions of the characters. We're not told of their motives. But the circumstances show how muddled and messy the situation was. And that in itself is why the story of Esther is so important to us. The author is skillfully describing a morally ambiguous and complex situation because that's the way real life often is in this fallen world. We have a tendency to want to flatten our Bible characters into good or bad, one side or the other, sinners or saints, but they're not like that. And if we're honest, we're not like that. If we saw our lives from the outside, we might find a similar mix. We read the book and we might think, well, she shouldn't have done that. And it can be all too easy to look at what others do and think that if we were in their shoes, we'd be different. But we know that life isn't always that neat and tidy. There might come a day when we find ourselves in a situation where every choice seems to have a mix of good and bad. But even if we make the wrong decision, whether through blunder or disobedience, God in his grace is still able to use that link in a chain that will perfect his purposes in and through us. God's grace is bigger than any exploitation we may experience and bigger than any compromises we've made. What the book of Esther tells us is that whether we're compromised or exploited, whether we've been assimilated into the culture or broken by what's happened to us, God will make all things right. If not now, then one day.